Okay. Good morning and welcome back, and thank you for showing up on time. And Andreas says we're live, so we're good to go. So, day 2 of the ABK, or a Arthur Bernhard Knapp event. And our first speaker needs no introduction on this island now. Dr. Lindy Crew, Director of Carey and omnipresent helpful person and co-organizer of this event, excavator at Scales, and generally spectacular success. Her talk is Mortuary Practices at the Chalcolithic Cemetery of Susciu-Laona. Thank you, Lindy.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, everyone. I have an error message, but hopefully it's okay. Let's see if we can get rid of that. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that I hope intersects with Bernhard's research interests of landscape archaeology and mortuary archaeology by discussing some of our recent finds at the excavation of Susciu-Laona Cemetery. You can see I've highlighted in red the location of the limestone outcrop that comprises the Laona Cemetery. In this very dramatic and gorgeous part of the Cypriot landscape, you can see this narrow ridge spur here, where the cemetery is located at this side. The settlement up here. We have the Reassess river valley mouth leading to the Mediterranean, the Vasa Caucus ravine here, and you'll see we had some further cemetery components located over there. But it is a magical spot and perhaps something to do with why this site is so intriguing and important. Just have to say briefly that the publication has gone to Oxbow and it's going to be printed in July. We are delighted about this. And I'm not showing this just as an ad for a book, but also because I could not present this paper today without the important contributions of the specialists, and particularly Diane Bolger and Eddie Peltenberg's work on all the different aspects of the material and the sites. I keep getting an error message. Say okay. So, further to the landscape location, you can see here in this map by Ben Blackman that Susciu is located on the Reassess on this route up from the coast to the Troodos Mountains. And as Eddie Peltenberg asserted back in 2011, it's surely likely that the case is that as people were foraging for this important material of the Chalcolithic picrolite, they were becoming more aware of the copper sources of the Troodos Mountains, and it is at this point in around the Middle Chalcolithic that we first start to see use of indigenous Cypriot copper for personal ornaments, and I'll show a couple of those later as well. The other important feature is this geographical boundary where we have these lowland plains of Ravine, of course the Kouros River, an important source of picrolite pebbles washing down, and the Katima lowland sites here, these very important clusters of settlements, Susciu located at the nexus of all these sites. Here again you can see the location of the Laona Cemetery, the settlement area, and the Susciu Vatakakas Cemetery components. Cemetery 1, fully published. The other components are known. It is not known how many tombs, how looted they may be, or any information further. But this site has been surveyed over the years. We have David Rupp, who surveyed it back in the 90s. We have, or before the 90s, Sophocles Hadjisavas, I don't think is here. But many of the people who have worked at Susciu and excavated at the sites are also here today, which is great as well. And what seems to be the case, due to Harry Paraskev's important work on the chronology, Diane Bolger's work on the pottery, the site is established in the Middle Chalcolithic, the settlement, and the Laona Cemetery seems to be contemporaneous, and perhaps the Laona Cemetery became full, and the Susciu Vatakakas cemeteries were instigated, and it seems that there is some overlap in the cemetery areas, but Vatakakas continued for longer than Laona, and the settlement, as you'll see, continued for longer than both the cemeteries. So why do we have such interest in these sites? The iconic cruciform figurines manufactured from picrolite, as well as other materials such as limestone, this Getty example you see here. We don't know that much about many of these objects because the majority of them are in private collections, or such as the case of the Yalia figurine, provenanced only to village location. We don't really know much about how these were used by people, and we know that a lot of these are attributed to Susku. In fact, all of these, I just found out recently that the Getty figurine is in fact attributed to Susku as well. And these anthropomorphic and zoomorphic vessels and figurines are part of this repertoire as well. So the site here, and in springtime, particularly striking, the limestone outcrop standing up in the landscape. Here you can see the view that we were confronted with when we first began excavation, what looked to be an entirely depleted, looted cemetery. Open tomb apertures, piles of looters' spoil, and capstone fragments scattered around the cemetery. These were smaller arrangements of stones with large limestone slabs that were used to seal the tombs between burials. So we didn't have very high hopes that we were going to come upon intact tombs. We began to clean the surface, expose the looters' spoil heaps, trying to think about things that objects that looters may have missed, or aspects such as the human remains that looters are surely not interested in. And we also discovered that we were a lot more determined than many of the looters had been. In many cases, capstones had fallen into the tombs. Looters couldn't be bothered retrieving them. We, therefore, came upon many only partially looted tombs, and in fact, many also that the looters had entirely missed. So we 100% almost exposed the cemetery, and you can see here that we have been able to define several types of tombs. Some were expected from previous work at Socio-Ecological, but particularly here you see the shaft tomb. These are round or rectangular, subrectangular oval apertures widening slightly down to an oval subrectangular base, either with or without one of these so-called capstone cuts, a horizontal platform in which to arrange the ceiling stones. And I have divided them further into shafts and small shafts. Shafts 1.5 to 2.5 meters deep, and small shafts less than 1.5 meters deep. And this is because the shorter members of our team certainly were unable to extricate themselves alone from a tomb deeper than 1.5 meters. And so this is important for thinking about cooperation and size of the groups doing the digging of the tombs, as well as the participants in the funerals themselves. Pits are a more heterogeneous category. I'll come to those in a moment. An unexpected feature were these small scoop pits, which is essentially like someone taking an ice cream scoop to the bedrock, and these small features are scattered around the cemetery adjacent to the tombs as well. So the geology of the outcrop is variable, nice hard Kafkala mixed with crumbly eroded Havara and these mixed deposits, and to some extent the typology of the tombs is dependent upon where in the outcrop they were dug into. But it seems that the aim of the tomb diggers was the shaft type. We also get some interesting patterns of clusters of tomb groups, and perhaps most clearly here, a central starter tomb perhaps, surrounded by a circle of later tombs. And perhaps it's visible in these other clusters as well. You can get a sense that the orientation is a little bit random. Perhaps the orientation may have something to do with these clusters as well as other reasons. Interestingly also, even though we consider the cemetery to be full and it went out of use, we do have these open reserved spaces. And these seem to be of significance, particularly this flattened area of the limestone right in the center of the outcrop. But we can imagine, again, areas reserved for the funerals, for processing around the cemetery, or other commemorative and other rituals going on at the site. I'm just going to focus in on the finds we had from 3 of the interesting tombs. Tomb 108 up here, 168 and 207 down there, to just give you some examples of the types of evidence we've retrieved. One of the interesting features is that there are quite strict rules for how the dead are arranged within the tombs. The typical pattern, and you can see this tomb was looted up to this level, and this is an intact burial deposit, is an articulated individual located with the head to the south-southeast area, lying in a flexed position on its right side with the hands up near the face. And at the other end, we find these disarticulated earlier interments, which have been pushed to the northwestern end of the tomb. Long bones are arranged in neat piles, and skulls arranged on the top. and there's up to 8 of these disarticulated individuals in one end of these tombs. We came to call them bone stacks. But these are not large spaces by any means, generally sort of about 1.7 meters by 80 centimeters wide. It is a very cramped, confined space in there. And I should thank our osteologist, Kirsty Lorenz, for all the information about the human remains. So this probable female, we found her with this picrolite pendant in the chest cavity area. Reasonably, she was wearing this around her neck, suspended on a perishable material, but here we have a nice association of an individual with an item of personal adornment. To give you an idea of the complexity of this bone stack material, you can see here, this is 7 individuals. We really had to excavate these like a jigsaw puzzle, carefully taking down layers, planning, recording, photographing, packaging up each bone in its own labeled foil nest. And you can see this is why it took 6 seasons to excavate this cemetery. So we had many cases of nice surprises where we expected a tomb to be looted when we found it open, and it was in fact entirely intact. This is our only example of a triple articulated burial. 3 individuals who presumably died either at the same time or very close time. A probable male, probable female, another probable female, adults. Very nicely here, all found with one of these types of pendants in their chest cavity, and it doesn't seem to be the case, therefore, that there is any distinction between the sexes in the types of personal adornment people could wear. At the bone stack end of this tomb, we came down upon 4 individuals, adults, sub-adults, 1 child. At the base of the tomb, we retrieved this vessel here, and these 2 little vessels, which we like to call grape cluster pots, but Diane calls dark monochrome ware, and this very nice little figurine, as well as some other little picrolite pendants. That vessel cleaned up to be one of these anthropomorphic birthing vessels. You can see she is seated on a birthing stool, legs are splayed, broken arms and legs, and this seems to be the case when these are deposited. They are pre-broken, the other fragments were not present, and she certainly looks like she has an expression that could be interpreted as the agony of childbirth on her face. And she's not as pretty, but comparable to the example from Socio-Ecological, which is again very nicely wearing an example of a pendant around her neck. Again, clearly a pregnant female, and legs missing from the tomb and smashed right through her pregnant belly when she was deposited in the tomb. So, associated with one of those grape cluster vessels. Whether these vessels had an apotropaic function, whether they perhaps failed in their role of ensuring successful childbirth and then were deposited in tombs, sadly we don't always have the sex of all the individuals to go with these. Another category is a very lucky find of a sealed burial with what was our only large picrolite figurine, found not within a tomb, but located in this shallow ledge adjacent to the tomb, mere centimeters below the topsoil surface. And there's another parallel at Vasa Caucus for a limestone phallus being deposited on the outside of a tomb as well. Feature 169, which is adjacent to 168, I will come to that in a moment. In the meanwhile, this tomb, the largest aperture at the site, more of a circular shaft than a widening shaft, was filled with 1.5 meters worth of rubble. When we excavated down to the base, we found the usual large capstone arrangement with smaller stones around it. You probably can't make out a groundstone axe deposited on top of that as well. And then beneath this was the burial layer. This is a very unusual arrangement. We were excavating it assuming we were dealing with perhaps 3 individuals here. In this case, no grave goods associated with the human remains. These 2 red on white pottery vessels placed upright on the base of the tomb. The other unique feature of this tomb is this black ashy silts around the bodies. It's the only case of burning in a tomb, but the bones themselves are not burnt, and it seems perhaps to be some low-level fumigation or some practice going on. After analysis of the human remains, Kirsty Lorenz was able to find even more interesting features about this burial. We have, in fact, a minimum number of individuals of 4, again, females and males, and we have these arrangements where partial cranium, complete crania, semi-articulated human remains with disarticulated remains arranged into these 3 groups, but each person has body parts from 2 individuals, and they've kind of made an attempt to give each cluster about the right number of limbs and bits and pieces that a person would need. So another intriguing aspect that comes along with this is, because we sieved all the deposits, really large numbers of chipstone debitage and these very lovely large cutting flakes which appear to have been manufactured above or within the tombs and are then probably used in processing of the bodies, manipulation of the remains, and then most likely considered unclean or some such, are then left in the tomb with the burials. And we have several instances of this practice. So here, these people, rearranged in this manner, definitely sealed in for good, no revisiting, reopening that tomb for whatever reason. Which brings me to this little pit 169 adjacent to 168, which was a pit sealed, intact, with finds and no human remains. And we have several instances of this. I will return to this in a while. But here we have a mirroring of this set of objects, 2 small balls upright in the base. And if that tomb was well and truly sealed, if there were commemorative rites, other rituals to be undertaken in relation to the individuals in that tomb, it seems that this could be considered as some sort of a proxy tomb for these actions. So you can see by this tomb status plan that indeed many of the features were entirely looted, shown in white, or extremely looted with only small intact deposits shown in light pink. But we were able to retrieve the information that whenever there was an articulated burial present, the head is invariably towards the southeast or the east area, and it does seem likely perhaps that sunrise was an important factor in considering which way to orient the tomb. And if tombs are being dug at different times of the year, then we would be getting slightly different orientations, but when the bodies came to be placed, it was important to place them in that direction. The other thing that we struggled with a little bit is that we do not have human remains in all of these features. Only 92 of 151 of these rock-cut features contained human remains. So we have to consider some of the deeper shaft tombs may have been dug and then never used. The cemetery was abandoned prior to anybody in that group needing a tomb. But we have all these smaller features that do not contain burials. I hope you can make out some of the detail in this, but this is the 31 rock-cut features that are either completely intact or of very high integrity, where we can start to think about deposition of different types of objects and different types of goods in the tombs. You can see the MNI, perhaps you can read that here, but we have anywhere from 10 down to 0, and the most commonly deposited objects are in fact dentalia and chipstone, but don't imagine that we're dealing with elaborate necklaces or bracelets. Sometimes it's 1, 2, 3 dentalium shell beads, sometimes it's a few pieces of chipstone debitage, and I haven't put the actual numbers here. This is just presents, or would be in the hundreds in some cases. But essentially, the other interesting aspect is pottery sherds. Whole vessels are well represented, but we have quite a significant number of sherds deposited. So it does seem like each feature should have some anthropogenic inclusion, whether or not we could classify it as grave goods. We have, again, very difficult to correlate MNIs with numbers of grave goods, so there's certainly no strict program of having to receive a complement of grave goods here. You can see a couple of tombs do stand out, 158, 159, 207, with higher numbers of grave goods, but considering that these are large numbers of sherds, and we have here, well, quite a few pottery vessels and sherds, which Diane was able to say that these tombs are dating to the last phase of use of the cemetery. So this period 1 to 2, which means that perhaps we see hints of, through time, increased deposition of grave goods, but with this severely looted mortuary scape, it's very hard to make firm assertions. Some tombs, like we have a very high MNI in 192, these objects here, it's a bit of chipstone, it's a couple of pebbles, and it's one headless picrolite. So that's a lot of people to really not have any grave goods. So it doesn't seem that it was necessary to be equipped with picrolites or pottery or any other thing. If we look at just these features where we found objects and no human remains, you can see here some of our faience beads were found with a single human tooth inside this really nicely cut mini shaft tomb. And generally we find the types of objects that you would absolutely expect to find in a burial. And people are probably thinking to themselves, what about if these are for infant burials? We did consider that possibility, but we do have infant remains preserved with adults in the other shaft tombs, so it's certainly not the case that we've just lost the infant remains. There are cases where we do have, as well as the tooth being deposited, fragments of human bones. So again, this could be this deposition of anthropogenic materials as a necessary aspect of the funeral, but it doesn't have to be proper grave good as such. So this is some of the variety of the materials, the form, the size of some of these picrolites, as well as bone tusk examples, and now what Janet Ridout-Sharp has said is the earliest mother-of-pearl objects on Cyprus. And you can see anthropogenic, sure, but we have these ones which are hard to know what they perhaps mean. You could perhaps think that this is meant to be a schematic human without its arms, but they were not classified as figurative. But there really is a lot of variety. This one pierced through the mouth, this one with a very detailed face. Some of them, these triple examples. This one from Vasa Caucus, not Laona, is a very, very fine example. So there's a lot of variety, a lot of variability, and there seem to be a lot of different individuals making these. One of the more interesting aspects that came out of Liz Goring and Eddie Poltenberg's study of these is, again, giving some chronological elements perhaps, that the Vasa Caucus examples were primarily pristine, unworn, freshly made. The Laona examples have a greater instance by far of use wear. So at Laona, they seem to be wearing them whilst they're alive, and then they're being deposited in tombs. If we consider that Laona is in use first, then goes out of use, Vasa Caucus, perhaps we're seeing a change in the role of these objects through time, and really they become only important in funerary contexts slightly later. One of the nicest things has been to try and associate these objects, these grave goods, with individuals, although it certainly has not been an easy task. Here, again, these are some of our faience beads, which the analyses of Lina Cassianidou and Andreas Haralambous have shown to contain traces of tin. One of the copper spirals, there was another one from Vasa Caucus and another sort of pendant question mark from this same tomb, 158. They're pure copper, so plausibly Cypriot copper. But these three objects, a nice classic cruciform, which seems to be unworn, found in probable association with one individual adult male. So if we're seeing transformations in the types of personal adornment, the types of goods that are being deposited with burials, we seem to have an interplay here of these sets of objects. Tomb 237 was the only tomb where an articulated individual was lying on top of bone stack material. I dug this one. It took me an awfully long time, and it was also disturbed by a snake burrowing in and laying its eggs. So this is why we have these areas where it seems to be disturbed. There were snake eggs in the cranium up here as well, but it is actually an intact tomb. And here, this adult female seems to have 3 clusters of picrolites. She has a total of 10 pendants and beads with her altogether, and a very nice cluster at her pelvis, including some of these triple ones, one in the chest cavity area, so again suspended, and a little cluster that appeared to be a bracelet. And there were a few dentalia shell beads as well in here. And we have some instances of the association of picrolite cruciforms with the female pelvis only, none with males. But we do have other objects in association with male pelvis. And sometimes it's just a river pebble that has been deposited in there as well, or sometimes another kind of bead. But again, the severely eluted nature of this site means that we just don't have big enough samples to be able to say things with certainty. Oh, thank you. So very, very briefly mentioning the settlement, because these sites are all an integrated whole, there is extensive evidence for picrolite working. Debitage, preforms, rough-outs, all stages of the production process, and these relate to the earlier periods of the site. The final phase, when the Launa and Vathakaka cemeteries have gone out of use, we see a return to intramural burial in the settlement. And at this time, it appears that there isn't evidence for picrolite working. So we are seeing these cemeteries go out of use. We're seeing these transformations in the use of materials, and perhaps this is connected to changes in the value of materials and techniques. Intramural burials, no grave goods. So, very briefly, we do have this unique practice at Susku. As far as we know, the only known extramural cemeteries of the Chalcolithic on Cyprus, and we do start to see these greater inclusions of grave goods, setting Susku apart from what we know goes on elsewhere. But, as Dave Sewell has noted in the volume, it is a very steep slope the settlement is built on. A lot of the site has been lost to erosion. Perhaps initially the instigation of extramural cemeteries was about securing the security of the burials themselves, so they didn't just roll down the hill. But it certainly seems to have developed into something more important. It's about a 6-hectare site. It's not as large as Kasoniga or Chloricas or Erimi, but no other site has such extensive evidence for the picrolite working. And we are definitely seeing in the settlement nice evidence for the mining picrolite slabs from up in the Troodos, as well as taking water-worn pebbles from the rivers. So we might be seeing this increased production of picrolite pendants and figurines in association with the mortuary rituals, but it does seem, based on the Vathakakas' lack of useware, that they might have seen a decreased importance to the living at this time. And it does end. There's no more, apparently, cruciforms after the Middle Chalcolithic, but this is when we see this switch from copper being used for small personal ornaments to being used for effective tools, maybe weapons, and the late Chalcolithic is a different time altogether. Thank you very much.
Settlement, did you find a place for the manufacture of other objects, excuse me, besides figurines? In other words, vessels or axes.
Antler beads are a thing that they found manufacturing work for, and there's no pottery production areas, no. But
no, I'm talking about just picrolite for other kinds of. Because as I recall, at one point Eddie visited Ayas Savas, Rastio Ayas Savas, and produced a fragment of a bowl, a large bowl made out of picrolite. So I was wondering whether you saw.
No, I mean there's picrolite, what look like tools, but there's no other actual objects. No.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Lydia. Okay. Oh, I was wondering where he was. Our next paper is by Catherine or Katie Kearns, and great pleasure to have her here, and is one of the many people here who has benefited greatly from Bernhard's role as a mentor, editor, and otherwise. And let's just stop the time. And is going to be speaking on the limits of proto-history towards an archaeology of Cypriot Iron Age communities.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Stuart, thank you for inviting me to this. I feel very lucky to be part of this lineup. And thank you also for taking the words out of my mouth. I'm very appreciative to Bernhard for his critical eye on some of my work. And what I hope to do today was just really offer one kind of approach to the triangulation of temporality, landscape, and community that has been at the heart of much of Bernhard's work. So what I'm going to argue is that what we call a kind of macro-historical narrative, the ending phases of the late Bronze Age and the ensuing Iron Age, remain problematic, as both a difficult period for chronometric dating, as well as a conceptual challenge for identifying, analyzing, and interpreting the material records of breakdown and subsequent political, social, and economic regeneration. And so I think first we need more clear chronological boundaries and an investment in high-resolution dating methods, but also a stronger focus on the social orders and populations driving the transformations of the first millennium. And then I think one way forward is to analyze the making and history of communities, which is something that Bernhard explored in the context of protohistoric mining settlements on Cyprus. But in a more prosaic mode, I'm just really calling for more empirical information for this period as we move forward. So over the last decade, archaeological thought seems to be shifting to, or at least accommodating, a return to kind of macro-scalar approaches that substitute a granular focus on particulars for the wide-angle lens of big data, global comparative histories, and grand narratives. Large temporal and spatial scales of comparative analysis have indeed offered bigger canvases to take up historiographical questions that may or may not be partly driven by our contemporary anxieties: rising inequality and political upheaval, climate change, the Anthropocene, the sixth extinction. And so the framing of grand challenges, which we've seen also recently, and this was a conference I was just at, sort of puts a self-reflexive spotlight on future trends. What do the next 100 or 25 years of archaeology look like? These sort of big picture problems. In the grand narratives of Cypriot archaeology, and particularly in the studies of the centuries following the end of the late Bronze Age, I think despite an investment in macroscalar historical frameworks, the longue durée, we have a bit of a narrativity problem. So I'm going to use this sort of literary term, narrativity. We don't really know the characters or the plot or much of the setting. And what remains are these sort of teleological narratives of the formation of various autonomous polities by the mid-first millennium. So what we could call the field imaginary, it's the tacit assumptions, the convictions, how we set the boundaries of our field, what we take as self-evident, presents a canonical narrative of long-term continuity and regionally segmented statehood from the protohistoric period into the early first millennium BC. The arc is often set between the 13th century on the one end and the arrival of the Ptolemies in the 4th century on the other. And other elements of the story are the largely homogeneous material culture practices sustained throughout the period, the plurality of scripts and language groups, and by extension, ethnic communities, the emphasis on external contacts and trade, as well as a relatively fixed urban demography in long-lived settlements. So our insular focalization on this narrative has turned singular objects into actors or even protagonists with significant explanatory power. So one obvious example, the famous bronze obolos or spit with a Slavic inscription in Greek claiming ownership between the Bronze and Iron Ages, someone named Opheltas from a tomb from the 11th and 10th centuries at Polypifos Scales. It's been called a perfect example of a transitional phase between the Bronze and Iron Age writing practices, literacies, and linguistic communities. This telescoping between Gravegood and macro-historical arc makes for exciting archaeology, to be sure, but as others have noted, it is a precarious foundation for explanations of social, political, or economic continuity or change. And so another good example is the famous stele of Sargon II, found near Kition, which served to embody Neo-Assyrian sovereign power and territoriality in the image of the king, Sargon. Its mention of the kings of Cyprus, while programmatic, has served to distinguish the inscription as both a map of contemporaneous Cypriot polities, as well as an index of event-based history, or historicity. So unlike the obolus of Epheltas, the stela, which is used as a kind of proxy for transition, the stela of Sargon substitutes for an event. And so I've been thinking about kind of macro-historical narrativity, history, and temporality for the case of the emergence of Amathus and its landscape histories on the south-central coast, a site that, compared to what we know from other Iron Age centers, has been called a polity without prehistory. Such a language of time raises, I think, some interesting questions about our arbitrary periodizations, our chronological terms, and the analytical weight we give them for our conceptions of history and historical narrative. What does it mean that a site and its landscape don't possess prehistory? Is history or pre- or proto-history a quality that resides in certain places, or is it just a temporal phase? And in what way does the peculiar Amathusian pre- or proto-history implicate the survey findings of diachronic settlements and sites which have been found in the surrounding landscapes? The presumption of the conventional narrative is often that because Amathus doesn't have a prehistory, its populations had to come from some prehistoric antecedents, typically the neighboring valleys to the east, which had major late Bronze Age sites, Kalvazos Ias Dimitrios and Moroni Vornes, that were abandoned right around 1200, and so Amathus stepped into a power vacuum and took over management of the agricultural and metal industries. And so I've been thinking about the kind of stakes of what we call prehistory and proto-history, whatever we call history that comes after. And in the title of my talk, Limits of Prehistory, I've been thinking about linear terminology, how our language of time affects the ways in which empirical data are approached and narratives constructed. In the genealogy of a term like protohistory for Cyprus, from Eddie Peltenberg to Maria Kovu, there is both persistent attention to the uses and instrumentality of texts, directly or indirectly, related to or produced at Cypriot sites, and awareness of the meagerness or the scarcity of our records. For some, protohistory refers to a period on the island when what we have are mostly external textual sources that refer to its political or economic practices, when writing didn't either exist locally or were not really clear on how it was used. For others, the term just emphasizes the general scarcity of written evidence. So this is a time not quite textually oriented or fuzzy precisely because it lacks much textual evidence. And so the limits of protohistory for thinking about the Iron Age, for me, connote partly this fault line between ages and concerns of transition, epic change at stake in grand narratives, where on the spectrum we start history. But there are also metaphorical limits or limitations inherent in protohistorical periods that hinder analysis when we know so little about the surrounding practices of groups, communities, societies, and which therefore make comparative analysis quite difficult. And so limit here we could think of even closer to its etymological roots in limes or liminal. It's a kind of threshold between the bronze and iron, or classical antiquity, framed somewhere between them. And I should be clear, I'm not arguing today to move the goalposts of protohistoric Cyprus into the first millennium, nor to substitute the early Iron Age with another arbitrary periodization, but rather just to consider this as a historiographical problem in how we study the transition to the first millennium and its attendant transformations at different scales, but consistently with privileged attention to texts and fragmentary evidence of writing practices. So it's of course not new that the Bronze and Iron Ages differ not just in archaeological records, but in the construction and interpretation of those records and the privileging of certain categories of evidence. I just think we have scalar problems in how we're approaching time and space. So Iron Age chronologies are markedly relative, which is perhaps what affords them macrohistorical narrativity, as opposed to the increasing use of absolute chronometric dating methods in prehistoric and protohistoric research that helps contextualize and provide precision to relative sequences. Despite a lot of recent work in radiometric dating in the southern Levant and surrounding regions for the Iron Age, we have surprisingly few absolute dates for the first millennium. And there are well-known problems with the so-called Hallstatt plateau of the radiocarbon calibration curve, which unfortunately creates wide margins of error for dated samples between the 9th and 5th centuries. But recent work, for example, on the British Iron Age makes it less tenable to continue to argue that calibrating radiocarbon dates for the period is useless, or what has been called a disaster. Combined with advances in methods like wiggle matching and Bayesian analysis, and here I'll maybe talk to Sturt about this after if this is even possible, but I think it seems likely that we could start to construct more robust absolute chronologies for the Iron Age. Beyond the very, very helpful and intriguing radiocarbon data coming out of slag heaps, which I'm showing in this appendix through the really amazing work of Lena, there seems to be not enough, or a reluctance to consider rethinking our Iron Age temporalities along absolute lines or radiometric lines. And this is not to argue that radiometric dates should replace relative ones, but to call attention to a sort of willingness to work within fuzzy boundaries of ceramic or other artifact typologies and textual events for plotting our narratives. And as Bernhard has argued, we need to separate the timescale from the material culture that anchor cultural historical approaches and consider other frames, so scale, place, or community. Pinpointing the Iron Age on a chronological schema should not be an end in itself, but a means to analyzing the patterns of social life and the processes of change that transform different populations through periods of collapse or reformation. To put another way, I think there are more compelling questions that could be asked of the Iron Age if we take social groups and their interrelationships as a thing to be explained, and not as an assumed kind of baseline for understanding the historicity of continuity or collapse. So what I'd like to argue is that Iron Age narratives could invite more critical inquiry into the makeup of these social and economic orders, particularly practices of social distinction, political economy, sovereignty that become much more conspicuous by the 8th century after the Protohistoric period. And as Bernhard encouraged scholars to do over a decade ago now, one goal should be to reassess context in which a new sense of community may have emerged and how that might have occurred. Community as a framework or institution where socialization takes place seems one possible analytical entryway to dissecting the shifts in settlement economies, funerary and ritual practices, symbols of authority, interregional market strategies between the end of the Late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. And so in recent years, archaeologists have been rethinking definitions of community that capture how they are socially constructed, how they structure and are structured by interactions beyond the household, as an interface composed of individuals who don't necessarily always interact, but who share senses of affiliation. In particular, while collective practices are often strongly linked to place, scholars have argued that communities are not necessarily confined to particular sizes of settlement, so small site equaling village community, and that communities are just as likely to cut across spatial boundaries or to overlap them as to adhere to them. They can form and congeal under conditions of shared practice, interactions, or exchanges that occur in different times and places and at different frequencies, through anchoring spots like ritual gatherings or tasks like grain harvests. And Bernhard summarized this as studying communities through place to examine the relationship between locality and community and not taking particular scale or spatial relationships for granted. This dynamic approach has proven to be compelling when it entails multi-scalar perspectives, considering the internal divisions, emergent and conflicting interests or practices within and between collectives. Marks of distinction can serve as boundaries between members or to highlight community leaders who over time, through contingent modes of ownership, engineered their own social, economic, political positions. And so I think it's helpful to look at these relationships between a range of spatial and temporal scales and to interrogate which scalar arrangements were generated or constituted by particular political formations, for example, paying attention to how scales were socially constructed. It would be helpful if we think, for example, about the archaeological signatures one might expect from different kinds of idealized urban or dependent hinterland or big, small settlement relationships, and how our data challenge or reorient these expectations. While the archaeology of settlement structures and placemaking for the Iron Age is partly challenged by the inaccessibility of many of the known centers underneath modern towns, the numerous datasets of surface survey available for the island offer a compelling case for such tests of community development and polity formation, as John Cherry noted almost 15 years ago. That this is a problem that we could potentially think about or explore through survey evidence. And so for the sake of time, for the rest of the talk, I'd like to just give a couple of the examples of the ways I'm thinking about how we can interrogate different historical narratives, understandings of temporality and practice through new and legacy surface collections in the region of the Moroni and Vasilikos watersheds to the east of Amathus. So Amathus presents an interesting case study. Again, it's been called a site without prehistory for thinking historical processes at multiple scales because although it conforms in some ways to the narrative of polity formation during the Iron Age, its features and its landscape records suggest alternate forms of growth and community interaction. So in this first image I'm showing, it's a sort of mesoscale of sites that were recovered through multiple surveys, both in the immediate surroundings of Amathus to the west here, and the Vasilikos and Moroni region to the east, according to different temporal relationships between sites that indicate a complex series of relationships. So the image shows discovered sites categorized by their chronological occupations, whether as new foundations in the 8th, 7th centuries, particularly the Archaic period, or as occupying multi-period places that contain evidence of continuous or intermittent activity through different earlier periods, from the Neolithic to the Late Bronze Age. In the Vasilikos Valley, for example, interesting patterns emerge between sites reoccupying multi-period localities or reinvesting in copper mines and mortuary landscapes in new places without prehistoric presence. Strikingly, the recovered landscapes around Amathus indicate a very different pattern, with little to no Middle or Late Bronze Age material in association with archaic settlements. So are these patterns indicative of different localities becoming gathering places or sites of importance, of salience for community cohesion across the proto-historical transition? How might we test whether the proto-history of Amathus did belong further to the east in the abandoned landscapes of Kalavassos and Moroni after the end of the Bronze Age? A second kind of cross-section of survey data that looks very briefly at comparing some of these Iron Age settlements can help highlight how developing communities were pursuing different scalar arrangements with Amathus by the time this region became more populated in the mid-8th century. So I was curious to look more closely at some of these, and I'll just go back, some of these smaller sites found through survey, which often become glossed as dependent nodes between copper production sites inland and the coast, to consider community growth in places outside the urban centers, like Amathus. Recent and preliminary analysis by Ana Georgiadou of both this survey material as well as survey data collected in 2016-2017 has revealed interesting and compelling patterns. The fabrics, shapes, and assemblages seem to be oriented towards production workshops at Amathus, sharing material properties and stylistic attributes with the nearby center, although it is difficult to state whether they were produced locally or supplied directly from Amathusian workshops. Despite the close connections to both the ancient copper mines and near Kalavassos and the coast, however, only a few pieces of imported ceramics out of hundreds that were collected of diagnostic fragments can be confidently identified. So we're looking mostly at a ceramic production that is either local or very contingently tied to Amathus, and very, very few or seldom pieces of, quote, imports or foreign material. New survey work conducted in 2016-2017 has aimed to bring these differentiations into relief with more intensive study at targeted sites that show a range of Iron Age occupations and histories. Kalavassos Vunuratashi, for example, was first identified in the 1970s as a multi-component prehistoric site that included an isolated area with dense concentrations of archaic ceramics, about half a hectare in size. The ceramics recovered in the surface collections are largely plain cooking wares, storage vessels like pithoi, basket-handled amphorae, grinding vessels like mortaria or stone basins, which indicate a domestic and perhaps agropastoral processing site of the later 8th to 6th centuries. Geophysical survey at the site, including magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar, also suggests a relatively discrete settlement with a few buried walls and potential installations for heat-intensive activities, which is particularly that circular thing you're seeing in the data. In the Moroni Valley, survey work in the 1990s revealed a high concentration of Iron Age materials to the south and southeast of the late Bronze Age site of Moroni Vornes. Excavations revealed a small sanctuary built within the monumental remains, oriented to a male and female pair of deities associated with potentially fertility, mostly in the form of small terracotta votives. Recent survey work has confirmed this archaic reoccupation, and geophysical survey has located several promising areas of potential buildings or installations. The ceramics show similarly high numbers of coarser utilitarian vessel fragments, including amphorae and pithoi, as well as diagnostic finewares associated with the late Bronze Age occupations. Preliminary analysis of the assemblages at Vunuratashi and Vornes confirms their differences in chronological span. At Vunuratashi, the majority of diagnostic pieces are Iron Age, and more specifically, archaic to early classical in date, with only a handful of either late Bronze Age or Roman pieces. While at Vornes, the diachronic use of the Moroni coastal area, or the littoral, is much more evident, with significant amounts of late Bronze Age as well as Hellenistic and Roman material present. This recent survey work has corroborated the trends seen both in excavated tombs in the region for a small percentage of imported wares, as well as the previous survey data, suggesting some kind of either inaccessibility to trade networks or potentially different logics of consumption, different access to trade. Vuneratashi, for example, may exemplify a gathering of community actors around tasks like agricultural production, geared toward either investment towards extractive production from a place like Amathus, or locally controlled, limited in space, investment in landscapes through things like terrace walls that previously built in the Bronze Age. Vornes, on the other hand, suggests a different space for socialization, linking ritual acts with the visible remains of late Bronze Age, but suggesting a smaller, structured scale of interaction outside of Amathus. The ceramic assemblages from the Vasilikos Valley raise several interesting possibilities for understanding the developments of regional communities. And this was just showing the very little evidence we have for imports in this recent survey material. So the ceramic assemblages from the Vasilikos and Moroni valleys raise several interesting possibilities for understanding the developments of regional communities. The intensification and mobilization of agropastoral produce in these valleys may indicate intentional strategies of the political class of Amathus, conditioned through more extensive kinship or group networks that integrated the produce and resources of dependent sites like Vuneratashi with the social rituals of Amathusian elites. These lines of acquisition and the wealth that they afforded may have helped forge new social capital and authority at Amathus, chiefly displayed through rich burial offerings, but potentially replicated by those looking to gain status distinction in smaller communities. On the other hand, we can also surmise the existence of locally situated actors or groups with their own spheres of Mediterranean interconnection, whose ability to manage and control the production of semi-luxuries, in the words of Lynn Foxhall, like olive oil, for example, in increasingly productive fields, created opportunities for independent networks and status differentiation amongst local groups, and a more malleable territorial relationship to Amathus. Sites like Vuneratashi and the archaic occupations at Moroni Vornes don't really offer up grand narratives, but they give some insight into the social orders and populations driving the transformations of the first millennium, and they call into question our canonical or conventional macro histories. Whether or not they represent singular communities or shared senses of affiliation is really quite difficult to discern at this stage. Surface survey can only go so far in recovering these dynamics. Future excavations at these and other sites in this region intend to explore these questions, as well as to build up hypotheses for exploring community interrelationships and interactions at multiple scales. And so to finish up, we could think, or we could experiment with some other prefixes of history for thinking about narratives between the second and the first millennium. We might adapt something like parahistory, histories that are at once analogous and parallel to, but also distinct from, a conventional historical narrative. In addition to possibly capturing the indirect sources of Cypriot political formations recorded through the modes of history writing of others, like Sargon, parahistorical narratives illuminate the ambiguities, the loose ends, the things that don't quite fit inside or outside of our canonical proto-histories. Such approaches may create a space for investigations of communities in regional, multi-scalar contexts, outside of the prevailing focus on cities and kings, into the more complex set of social and political dynamics. Thank you. I think I kept to time.
I didn't even get to the 5 minutes. So there's 5 minutes available for questions or comments. Well, I will ask one while somebody thinks about one. Oh, John's going to ask one.
I was just curious if either you could comment, or if you want, just flip the question straight back to Sturt, about the prospects for some seriously improved resolution of absolute radiocarbon dates during the Hallstatt Plateau.
Yeah, I was mentioning studies that I was reading on the British Iron Age. Stuart might want to answer this, but at least for the Cypriot case, we need data to actually test. But start. I don't know the possibility of wiggle matching for the Hallstatt.
So people like Derek Hamilton have done lots of interesting things in the British IMA. Principal by the end of this year in Cal 19, although we're running late. That was up this morning at 5 a.m. working on part of that. And that will improve things. We're finding more shape by doing single-year resolution dates. However, the basic problem in Cyprus is the lack of data, and there's great potential to do wiggle matching and using Bayesian analysis. It's a simple case of having some high-resolution samples that are tied to specific things. So I think you could get order of magnitude change with probably 50 well-placed dates from well-placed contexts. Any other questions?
In the CPSP, generally speaking, the lack of imports in the Cypriot-Archaic 8th, 7th, 6th century would be matched, though we didn't look at specific sites that intensively. There are very few.
Yeah, and this is something I've looked at for the Amethystian case, which of course has really incredible urban mortuary context, and then when you look at the kind of rural context, we don't see imports, but what's interesting is that, you know, a site like Tokni Lacha right on the coast has the kind of continuity between the Bronze and Iron Age, so things are happening on the coast at a kind of, quote, trading site. So what that then suggests to me is that there's something else going on other than just inaccessibility to material, that there's some other sorts of practices of consumption by which imports are either coming in the form of transport amphorae and making their way up and down valleys, or but that the sort of fineware is not becoming parts of the sort of mortuary practices that we see in urban sites like Amathus.
Well, Polypophos, if you only looked at Polypophos, you see a totally different picture of imports, etc. That does not go into the hinterland, as far as we were able to document.
Yeah, but we need sites in the hinterland so that we can start sort of refining this in terms of chronology. Yeah. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Georgia Andreou, who is a product of, in fact, the room we're roughly sitting in, so product of the University of Cyprus, the Archaeological Research Unit, who then went and worked in Edinburgh with Eddie Peltenberg and subsequently came to Cornell, worked with me as a postdoc, has now moved on to Brown, amongst others with John, and all through that has had a number of contacts, and particularly fundamental publication in JMA. So again, represents somebody who the work of Bernhard and Bernhard's critical approach, which I think usually begins by saying this is hopeless before actually assuring you at some point that actually it's quite good. So I'd like to welcome Georgia to speak to us. She's going to be talking about reconsidering the mountainous landscapes of Cyprus in antiquity. Georgia.
Thank you, Stuart. It's a pleasure to present a paper to honor Bernhard Knapp, a prominent scholar in the archaeology of the Mediterranean and a prolific writer of Cypriot archaeology. My paper is inspired by Bernhard's scholarly legacy on landscape archaeology, combined with his work on the Sydney Cyprus Survey Project and the Troodos Archaeological and Environmental Survey Project. In my paper, I explore how the introduction of new forms of environmental knowledge during the British colonial period has influenced archaeological research design and was eventually integrated into broader narratives of ancient Cyprus. My discussion focuses on the Troodos Mountains as a conceptual rather than a geographical or geological feature. Most of us are familiar with the geographical and geological qualities of Troodos. The Troodos Mountains are an integral part of archaeological reconstructions of the Cypriot economy, with a focus on its copper-rich pillow lavas, and I think we've seen enough talks about this topic so far. As archaeologists, we create artificial spatial divisions to convey the ancient landscape to readers with a primarily Western knowledge base. It's not a surprise, then, that geological classifications have made their way into ancient landscape classifications and subsequent interpretations. In this problematic association, the two survey projects I mentioned stand out for challenging the ontological boundaries of the ancient Cypriot landscape and for offering unprecedented insights to our limited understanding of the mountain communities of the island. I'm exploring these insights through my own interest in post-colonial geography and its relationship to Cypriot archaeology. The study of how we perceive our surrounding environment and how we reproduce this perception in maps, in historical narratives, has been recently summarized by William Rankin as geoepistemology. Since the 90s, a number of researchers have drawn from social and literary theorists to criticize the alleged objectivity of representational maps, and it's generally agreed that maps inevitably codify the interests and worldviews of their makers. In this context, my paper discusses the problematic relationship between the colonial construction of the geography and geology of the Troodos in association with its imagined antiquity. To do that, I consider the Troodos Massif as a conceptual feature born by an exploitative colonial view combined with an antiquarian perspective that emphasized the classical past of the island. I then argue that our understanding of the ancient human-environment interaction at Troodos is, among others, the product of this association. This association has offered the basis for future archaeological work, the conceptual biases of which have been highlighted by the Sydney-Cyprus Survey Project and the TISP. Before discussing the conceptual construct of Troodos, I will provide a short summary of post-colonial geography to highlight its relevance to the archaeology of Cyprus. Both historians and geographers have argued that power relations in the colonial present permeate all forms of understanding the world. The deep implication of colonialism and what we call European culture began to be explored systematically in the 60s, especially through Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. This type of post-colonial scholarship is distinguished from earlier approaches toward the study of colonialism by its integrally self-reflexive political dimension. In fact, it has been termed as a kind of activist writing committed to understanding the power relations that frame colonial interactions and identities and to resisting imperialism and its legacies. Geography's colonial encounter has been reevaluated since the 90s, and the relation between the very formation and institutionalization of the discipline with imperialism is irrefutable. Hudson offered the first major critical engagement with geography's imperial heritage. Hudson documented the connection between geographical explorations, the geopolitical self-interest of European states, and the exploitation of recoverable economic resources and local populations. He also noted the assumptions of the emerging discipline, for example, racism and environmental determinism, linked this wider social project to the development of university geography, and revealed the role of elite geographical societies, for example, the Royal Geographical Society that has produced a number of maps for Cyprus. This was followed by other important publications reevaluating the geographical project of the empire, for example, Edward Said's Orientalism and Mary Louise Pratt's Imperial Eyes, which produced geographical narratives that combined both European travelers' accounts as well as testimonies of colonized peoples. Decolonizing geography socially and institutionally has been a struggle to confront, with active attempts to dismantle what some have called the unbearable wideness of geography. Overall, the possibility of producing a truly decolonized post-colonial knowledge is currently a subject of considerable debate within disciplines such as anthropology, literary criticism, and development studies. Archaeologists have reflected on how their discipline is shaped by colonial forces, tracing the intimate relationship between imperialism and forms of archaeological knowledge. Inevitably, several major themes have emerged from archaeologists' engagements with post-colonial studies, including the critique of colonial traditions of thought, as well as the production of new accounts of the past that emphasize indigenous and subaltern experiences. In the context of the Eastern Mediterranean, the last decade has seen the publication of studies that investigate, critique, and sometimes counter the extent to which archaeologists participated in 19th and 20th century colonialist enterprises. And those of you that have visited Maroni, they have in mind an example. In the context of Cyprus, Michael Given's work stands out for its invaluable perspective on the impact of British colonialism on the production of vernacular and historical narratives. Despite this thriving research infrastructure, the intellectual concerns of indigenous archaeologists closely mirror those of their Western counterparts, stressing cultural history, subsistence practices, and social evolution. Such similarities can be explained in part by the fact that scholars from former colonies, Cyprus included, are often trained in European and North American programs. Meanwhile, Euro-American scholars are largely the gatekeepers of knowledge about others, as it is obvious in mainstream scientific literature. Like many parts of the world, the structures and modalities of the Cypriot state were conditioned by its colonial history. Michael Given has already discussed how the topographic and cadastral maps, and we see an example of the cadastral maps on the top left, have changed the relationship of Cypriots with their landscape, houses, and patrimony. Colonial maps, characterized by a panoptic view, have rapidly replaced the local control of the representation and narration of the Cypriot landscape. The mathematization of map making through triangulation, first used by Kitchener, as well as the introduction of a geometric grid, introduced new ways of imagining the Cypriot space. These new geometric rationalities have replaced what used to be fluid boundaries and instead normalized the depiction of clearly demarcated topographical and administrative boundaries. These boundaries have become the norm in the post-colonial administration of Cyprus, and I think a lot of us are using the portal of the Department of Land Surveys. Sarah Harris has highlighted the differences between the indigenous and colonial views of the Cypriot landscape using examples of the forest maps produced during the British colonial period. So she emphasized on the British perception of degraded landscape, its problematic relationship with unregulated goat grazing, as well as attempts in the form of education and legislation to promote rational forestry, an approach that was not based on the Cypriot experience. These attempts have enforced a new engagement with the mountainous landscape of the island as a place of leisure. Strict regulations regarding the exploitation of the forests in Cyprus have led many families to lose their basic forest-derived income. This also led to the abandonment of villages, as people chose to migrate to find work somewhere else, instead of repeatedly breaking the law and possibly being imprisoned or having their flock confiscated. A change in the local perception of Cypriot landscape is reflected in the continuation, and by some even praise, of British policies by the Cypriot authorities after independence. One example is Dimitrios Christodoulou, who produced a detailed geographical study that is appraised and widely cited for its ethnographic qualities in archaeology. In the introductory note, it is mentioned that the author of the monograph was born in a small village of Cyprus, and in the country of his birth he has spent his life, realizing as he did from a daily first-hand contact the vital necessity that the young people should know and understand the meaning and influence of their environment before they could take any effective part in shaping its future. He came to Britain to equip himself by reading for an honours degree in geography of the University of London. Unlike colonial geographers, Christodoulou's work is distinguished by the use of ethnographic interviews. As a native speaker, he was able to appreciate local variabilities, for example in the use of toponyms, which however he could not include in his final maps. Instead, he had to use the Latinized version of toponyms with clear emphasis on foreign legibility. Christodoulou's perspectives inevitably reflect his academic training. Similar to British colonists, he viewed traditional landholding practices, for example the very small and fluid peasant holdings, as unsustainable. On the heated topic of forest protection from the natives, he empathized with local reactions to British restrictions, yet described some of the people resisting the new status quo as, quote, not the best type of citizen. Christodoulou's work is extensively cited in archaeological publications and very much praised for its ethnographic qualities. Nevertheless, little critique has been placed on the colonial infrastructure that created this phenomenal work. Our source of material evidence for building historical narratives on the island derives from surveys and excavations that largely lay outside of the mountainous regions. So I probably need to update these maps with some additions, so it was produced in 2016. The mountains are represented largely by atypical structures, for example churches, bridges, and of course copper mines. Few exceptions include the excavation of Roudias near Xeros River at Paphos district. Based on the early cartographic representation of Cyprus, however, one can see that mountain valleys have been consistently populated over multiple centuries. While there may not have been permanent settlements on some of the steeper slopes, there certainly were permanent inhabitants in the valleys. For the population to persist in the mountains, they must have developed some sort of sustainable living. Nevertheless, our knowledge on the habitual activities of ancient mountain communities is limited. This leads to two interrelated questions. One, why is there such limited research on the mountains? And two, what are the Troodos Mountains? Although the Cypriot Mountains are a key feature in archaeological narratives, with the exception of the Sydney Cyprus Survey Project and the Troodos Archaeological and Environmental Survey Project, their archaeological exploration has been remarkably patchy. This is certainly not a unique case in the Mediterranean and has been linked with Western perceptions of mountainous landscapes. as well as the disembedded relationship archaeologists have with the natural environment. Similar to other Mediterranean case studies, mountain people in Cyprus are viewed as different than their lowland counterparts, which is very much related to a view of the topographic relief of the mountains as a factor of isolation. It is partly true that the dearth of evidence for early human activity in areas above 2,500 meters around the world is explained by the relative remoteness and ecological poverty of such zones. We should not forget, however, that the difficulties in accessing high-altitude areas varies from region to region. Many Mediterranean high-altitude zones are relatively easy to access, and the extreme variation in Mediterranean topography often results in landscapes where vertical height can be accessed over relatively short and horizontal distances. One problem in demonstrating that people have always incorporated these zones into their lifeways is the fact that the archaeological signals are often ephemeral. Although this, among other challenges, is known, for some time ancient historians and archaeologists have considered mountain societies as detached from those on the plains. This notion was particularly prevalent among colonial geographers and historians that often considered mountainous landscapes as marginal. This is, of course, not the case, as evidenced by a number of mountainous sites found in so-called marginal landscapes, for example, in 800-meter elevations in Roman Tunisia. Another useful case is the Grevena highland zones that bear evidence for regular use, possibly as early as the end of the Neolithic, with pastoral activity probably practiced during the Middle to Late Bronze Age. More recent work from the northern Pindus Mountains indicates human impact from as early as 6,000 years ago, when there was a rapid reduction in tree diversity and density. Cretan societies also made use of the high-altitude zones during the later prehistoric periods in patterns that some found that bear similarities with the Alps and the Iberian Mountains. Overall, archaeological and paleoenvironmental data from Mediterranean mountains do not agree with traditional environmentally determined hypotheses. Moreover, the fact that there has not been a continuous, steady exploitation of the high-altitude zone during the last 6,000 years implies that knowledge of and attitudes towards this landscape has fluctuated over time, possibly with the exception of pastoralism. This is not to say that there weren't differences in the everyday experiences of landscape and environment, their cultural ecologies, and possibly also the cosmologies of people inhabiting different altitudes. It's more reasonable to argue, however, that an understanding of mountainous landscapes demands an environmental perspective, which will clarify important variations in and the emphasis placed on exploitation of each vertical zone. The notion that we can develop generalized arguments regarding the nature of human-mountain relationships based on the commonality of environmental characteristics across vertical zones is clearly problematic. Other than mining, pastoralism, and silviculture, there are clearly many other important activities which varied in their extent and intensity depending on the socioeconomic context and forms of environmental knowledge present within each valley. So what is the Troodos? If we follow Buxton's conclusion in the study of imaginary mountains in Greek mythology, a mountain is in the eye of the beholder. Buxton identified the main characteristics of the mythical imagination of the Oros. An Oros is a height outside inhabited and cultivated space outside the city. It's a place where mythical herdsmen practice transhumance, as well as a source of wood. For example, the Trojan horse was made of mountain pine. Mountains are one way or another related to the origins of humans, citing the myth of Deucalion. And finally, mountains are places where the human and divine come together. For example, he cites Hesiod, who meets the Muses on Helicon. This, of course, can be contextual. For example, in Egypt, Oros may signify the desert in contrast with the fertile and cultivable Nile Valley. Sources on the local perception of mountains are more limited in Cyprus, but also a topic that I cannot adequately cover within the time constraints of this talk. It's worth mentioning briefly that references to mountain copper exist in Akkadian documents from Mari and Babylonia. Mountain copper seems to be intentionally distinguished from just copper and refined copper. In addition, in the Temple of Amun, 31 figures appear as personifications of various mineral-bearing regions, including what is described as the Mountain of Alashia, with references to countless quantities of silver and bronze. I think all of us agree that copper is a very important aspect of the Troodos Mountains. We probably also agree that the defining characteristics of mountainous areas is vertical zonation, which is the relationship between environments across vertical zones, as well as the types of seasonality of activities that take place in each zone. These notions underpin the frameworks and models for much research in mountains in the Mediterranean. In most cases, mountains are defined by the natural limit of the forest, but those limits advance and retreat depending on climate and human exploitation. Although we agree on these particulars, Troodos is not mapped consistently in archaeological scholarship. So I will show examples of maps that map the Troodos, but it's not clear where the boundaries are. And a lot of the talks yesterday and today have also mapped Troodos, but not in the same way. So in this case, we have notes on the different elevation marks. It's broken down in 300 and 400 meters, but it's not clear why. In this case, it's just represented with different colors, but emphasis is placed on the location of the mines. And in the case of Keswani, it's mapped, I think, around the 100 or 200 meter elevation. So it's not clear where and what the Troodos is in archaeological scholarship, in my view. Archaeologists tend to use different elevation classifications, which in my view highlights the fact that mountains is in the eye of the beholder. One consistent theme in these maps is the location of copper mines, which reflects a primarily economic conceptualization of Troodos. I don't think this can be viewed separate from the colonial imagination of the geography of the island, a project that focused on resource control and exploitation, but also viewed Troodos in association to wilderness and leisure. The association of Troodos and leisure has been produced by the British perception of the area during the construction of the hill station in 1878. Varnava provides significant information regarding the British conceptualization of the Troodos. He cites, for example, Forwood, who remarked it was the British who discovered Troodos, to refer to the conversion of Troodos to a resort and its lack of resemblance to a typical Cypriot village. Varnava also highlights the need of the British to have a familiar scenery, with references to Sir Samuel Baker, who found that approaching Troodos was like entering one of those picturesque valleys for which Devonshire is famous. Samuel Baker described Roditsa Monastery as a family of English barns that had been crossed with a Swiss chalet. Wolseley wrote in his diary that the villages in the area had a Swiss air about them, and Kitchener wrote that when approaching Troodos from the north, the villages of Pedoulas and Prodromos resembled villages in Switzerland. The colonization of Cyprus and the reimagination of its landscape coincides with intensive antiquarian interest on the island and the wider region. Mycenaean and Roman material culture were particularly important to the colonial agenda, and the view of the history of the island through the lens of its classical past has masked the indigenous imaginations of the landscape. Strabo's accounts on the vegetation of the island became even more relevant, and the Roman slag heaps provided useful indications for locating mining locations. This is clearly stated in the history of the Cyprus Mines Corporation that mentions in the introductory chapter that the British tried to rediscover the old mines, and such attempts were dormant since the Romans had abandoned them 50 centuries earlier. Bernhard has long highlighted a need for more theoretical discussions on the archaeology of Cyprus, and his work on the Troodos Mountains, among others, has laid the ground for important discussions on the ancient landscapes of the island. The Sydney Cyprus Survey Project, with its emphasis on the social archaeology of industrial and agricultural landscapes, and the Troodos Archaeological Survey Project, with its emphasis on unaltered spaces, have offered unique insights into the archaeology of natural places in Cyprus. With their solid ethnographic work, they have importantly highlighted the transformations in the public perceptions of natural places and wilderness. Thanks to the work of almost 100 scholars, students, and volunteers, TAISP has built up a rich data set encompassing surface artifacts, industrial waste, soils, plants, structures, activity areas, but most importantly, the memories of local communities. Thanks to all this, they have addressed a wide range of issues from seasonality to industrial-scale copper production and water sharing. And now, notes on future directions. Classics offer invaluable information on the significance of natural features, even at the time when monumental architecture had assumed a vital role. Ariadne Constantinou, for example, has recently discussed female mobility and gendered space in ancient Greek myth to explore the limits of mythic imagination and imaginary geographies. Other scholars, for example, Yorgos Papandoniou, are currently looking into the role of sacred geographies and exploring the distribution of sanctuaries and their relationships to environmental features. Moreover, studies that rely on additional avenues of data have explored the intersection between myth and geology in what has been introduced in the 70s as geomythology. Recent examples of intersecting archaeological and paleoenvironmental data to reconstruct the vestiges of geomythology include the work of Kevin Walsh and colleagues in the Stymphalos Valley. Finally, as the dominant methods of land surveying and print publications have been increasingly replaced by electronic navigation systems, there has been a decisive shift in mapping practices. Although this shift did not render traditional maps obsolete, it did radically change our experience of geographical knowledge from the God's eye view of the map to the embedded subjectivity of GPS. Likewise, older concerns with geographic truth and objectivity have been upstaged by a new emphasis on simplicity, reliability, and convenience. This shift, in my view, will change the way new generations of archaeologists view the Troodos Mountains. Building on Bernhard's work on the Troodos and using new technological approaches, I'm looking forward to seeing new and theoretically engaged imaginations of the Cypriot landscape. Thank you.
Slow speed for your ear. Okay, we have a good 5 minutes for questions if you would like to ask
them. I'm sorry. In his 1984 study, in his 1984 book, Trigger argues that archaeology can exist as supporting either colonial, imperial, or national agendas. Do you think that Cypriot archaeology, since its inception as an antiquarian field during the British administration, has moved from colonial, imperial, and nationalist perspectives, or do you think that there is a stagnation of narratives within Cypriot archaeology?
What do you mean by Cypriot archaeology? Do you mean the archaeology produced by Cypriots on the island or by foreign missions on the island? Are you referring to the discipline, or are you referring to the first archaeological attempts on the island that are not very much archaeological?
What do you mean by that?
They took place before archaeology developed as a discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And that was taught in universities and had a clearer methodology and theoretical background. So I would like to think that archaeology now is less colonial than it used to be, but most of us here are trained in programs that have a colonial history.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that within the theoretical perspective, Cypriot archaeology is, well, using Anglo-American terminology, cultural, historical, processualist, post-processualist, or even further than that, people some days would argue atheoretical?
It's all those.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. It was super interesting, and I absolutely agree that we all misuse the Troodos, and it's often very confusing to get a sense of what we're trying to convey. Probably too big a question, but are you going to make us one that accurately does convey the meaning of these heights and these landscapes? Is it possible?
I still haven't collected this information, but I think we have to look into literary evidence where mountains are described one way or another. So far I only came across the Akkadian texts where they refer to the mountain in relationship to copper, but there should be much more for different chronological periods, but I need to find that. Yes. But I think it's promising, and I think in different chronological periods we may be able to map the Troodos with different extents. So, hopefully.
Everyone else puts their hand up soon. I think some area you really should have a look at is Tibet. And in particular, there's been a lot of really interesting work going between Pakistan and southwest China, looking at some extremely early exploitation of much higher elevations than you're talking about. And the interesting thing, of course, is it's exactly what you're describing. It would appear to be relative, and it depends on a whole range of issues as to what makes for a relative location, and in particular, of course, mobile populations within that zone. So you find evidence of economies at heights that technically seem to be impossible according to ecological constraints. So you find cereal products at an elevation which supposedly that cereal doesn't grow at. How does this work? Well, in the ethnographic recent past, of course, people who are living at much higher elevations come down, they trade, they exchange products, and then they bring these other products back to high elevations. So I think a lot of our understanding of how we tend to place things, the archaeology of place, what you find is what defines it, is not true. You have much more mobile populations, mobile economies, mobile resources, and it complicates greatly. It becomes a relative process of how people are using that environment and space. You want to say something? Okay, thank you very much for your gear. This is quite frightening. We're early.
They've not even used the extra
Okay. Okay, our next speaker is Michael Given. It's a great pleasure to have here somebody I've known since I first shared tables at the Cambridge Library. It's a great pleasure. And then Bernhard came and joined us, working at the Faculty of Classics in Cambridge, and has been fundamental, as has been, you're spotting the name Given on many, many of these maps and things, so has been fundamental to the rethinking of Cypriot space and landscape, and in particular as a result of working with, and I guess you would say cohabitating with, Bernhard over many years. I'm going to assume he's going to manage to make it back into the room in a second if you pause for a second or two. Michael's topic is From Settlement Hierarchies to Entangled Communities Towards a Theory of Survey. If you approach gently and slowly, maybe he'll make it back.
Thank you, Stuart. I am not going to start without Bernhard, if you'll excuse me. I will also say to Lena that my praise of Bernhard is integrated. So there we go. Well, I should hope so too.
Your time starts now.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. Fine. So when I sent this title to Stuart, I thought it was a nice, safe, uncontroversial title that would work quite well. I'd have a sort of romp through some nice intensive survey projects and try and detect a little bit of a theoretical trajectory, some ideas for the future. Then I did the work, and it has led me to some quite surprising, and speaking as someone who's built his career on intensive archaeological survey, it's led me to some really quite unwelcome conclusions. But to begin at the beginning, I started doing survey with Bernhard in 1995 as a fieldwalker on the Sydney Cyprus survey project. And if I can just add here that I think it was 3 years later that Bernhard won a fellowship for me at Glasgow. And it was that which started my career, essentially. And that is something that I continue to appreciate very much. During the 20 years or so that we've done survey in its various guises, including the long publication phases, I've increasingly wondered what things like this mean. All the spotty maps, whether they're sites or whether they're, as here, artifacts. And this is a difficult one. To put the same question in a slightly different way, can any of you think of a publication of a survey project which both has a robust, rigorous theoretical framework and convincingly, persuasively applies that framework to some equally robust survey data? I've asked a few people that. Maybe they're just hedging their bets. Maybe you are as well. I can't think of any. The Landscape Research Cluster at the University of Glasgow, they couldn't think of any either. Why is this? Now, obviously, there are theoretical structures. This is a little bit of a development. But how convincing all of these are, how well they've worked with intensive survey data is another question entirely. Now, any archaeological theorist will agree that we all have theoretical frameworks. It's just that sometimes we're not really prepared to admit it. So let's have a look back at intensive archaeological survey and just think about some of these even perhaps slightly implicit frameworks. One very helpful and very influential one is, of course, settlement hierarchy, which, thanks to Bernhard, has been enormously productive in Cypriot prehistory and even to some extent historical periods as well. And you've already seen this, but here is the 2003 version of this from the Skizip conclusion. Now, as I say, this is productive. This has some real explanatory power, and it is helpful. But I just wonder now, looking back on it, how limited some of these things are. It's very static. Okay, there is no sense of change. This is not a dynamic landscape. There's not this sort of interactive, recursive relationship between all of the different players here. Also, I find site hierarchies, well, hierarchical, frankly. Who's to say that the farming site is secondary or the city is primary? It's a bit like mountains. It's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And you could say the same for central place theory, perhaps. Though I do like Yorgos and Athanasius' refreshments of that recently, and catchment theory and all of that sort of thing, and GIS as well. This has been a real development in survey archaeology in the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. This is one of my favourite GIS paper, Andy Bevan on Lake Minoan 1 farmsteads. And you look at it, and it's about the proximity to water. The blue bits are the troughs, the drainages. There's Thyssen polygons. There's 150-metre catchments and everything. And again, this is explanatory. This is helpful. But I just wonder how limited this is. And there's a very interesting GIS literature on the environmental determinism that is implicit in a lot of GIS. I'm not quite aware of that sort of literature on intensive archaeological survey. What there is, however, is an enormous literature on survey methodology. Now, I worked on the Boeotia survey project here, more or less, in I think 1989. And it had been going for a while then, so the glory days of the methodological debate and controversy were getting towards their end there. They'd sort of settled down rather. But apparently they used to sit up and up until 4 o'clock in the morning debating, should we walk 5 metres apart and cover everything? Should we walk 10 metres apart and just cover 2-metre tram lines? Yes, it's world-shattering stuff. This is fantastic. They didn't laugh back in the 1980s at that, I can tell you. And so there's this very, very rich, or there was this very, very rich literature on the methodology. I think we've given up in the last 10 or 15 years. There's very few methodology papers, or if there are, they're sort of built into CRM and quantifying effectiveness and quality review and all of that sort of thing. We're more pragmatic about it. You use the methods that work for your terrain and answer your research question. Let's just get on with it. So more pragmatic, but certainly not more theoretical approach, or an approach that reflects on how we interpret this data. I forget when, nearly 15 years ago, a little bit more, someone called Chris Tilley went for a walk in the south of England, and landscape archaeology has never been the same since. Or at least British prehistoric landscape archaeology has maybe never been the same since. And that was the birth of phenomenology in archaeological landscape studies. This hasn't really made it into intensive archaeological survey. It's been tried. I had a go myself with Skizip data, best described as a valiant attempt, I would think. And it's interesting that there is only one paper that I'm aware of. All of this is provisional. Any suggestions about other things that I haven't read and I need to read, please, I'd be delighted. But this is the one that everyone cites. And the reason it works, phenomenology and intensive survey data, is because it's a methodology. It's a great methodology. It's about making hand signals at different distances. It's about different sounds at different distances, and you measure it all as you measure shard densities in a field. I think there's two problems here, apart from being so methodological. One is the problem of projecting what we make of the sounds and smells in the landscape, our own cultural choices and interpretations, projecting them onto the past. And that's fairly well demonstrated. The other thing with phenomenology and the dwelling perspective, you could even say, I suggest dangerously, community approaches, is they're all very anthropocentric. Okay? They're all very much about the human experience rather in isolation. But of course, we don't just live in human communities, we live in ecological communities. So I think there's a problem with this, apart from the sheer fact that it just hasn't worked in intensive archaeological survey. And there is a bigger problem here about survey, and Jorge has just done a fantastic job, thank you Jorge, at demonstrating this, is we depend on these things. We depend on maps. Survey is a totally Cartesian, top-down, God's eye view approach to the landscape, or an understanding of the landscape. And I don't say this lightly. Maps like this, these are my other children. Okay? I've spent a lot of efforts on things like this, and you're trying to map activity zones. So there's the core with eating and cooking and so on. There are agricultural activities like threshing, food processing, and so on. There's actual cultivation out there in the manuring halo, if you believe the manuring hypothesis, of course. Grazing and so on further out. Yeah, fine. Like central place theory, like settlement hierarchy, and so on. But it is still this top-down view of the landscape, this totally disengaged view of the landscape. So it's as if the survey archaeologist is this human colossus who strides across the landscape, deigning every now and then to kneel down and point a finger at some point that he in his wisdom has decided is important. So, and as again Jorge has demonstrated, this is part of a much wider tradition. Master of all I survey. Okay, Pratt's book that Jorge mentioned, for example, here's a lovely demonstration of this. Here is Cesnola as the survey director, standing out, with his white umbrella, his white dress against the darker background, pointing down at the landscape, saying, "Go there," and there's his intensive survey team, 5 meters apart. Well, right, those big sticks, they're for banging on the ground, and when it's hollow, there's a tomb underneath, so you can dig it out. But that is the colonial operation of systematic intensive survey. And it goes broader than Mediterranean intensive survey, and it goes much broader than Cyprus, perhaps even broader than the colonial period. Perhaps this is fundamental to the standard paradigm that modern science operates under, going right back to its origins, depending on where you want to put the origins of modern science. But say the 17th century with Francis Bacon there, this is the frontispiece to the history of the Royal Society in the 1660s. And the writer of that history and who puts forward this vision of science, this is Thomas Spratt. So this is science. This is truly to command the world, to rank all the varieties and degrees of things so orderly upon one another, that standing on the top of them, we may perfectly behold all that are below, and make them all serviceable to the quiet and peace and plenty of man's life. The root metaphor here, to use Jeremy Lent's phrase, is of course domination of nature as a way of understanding the world and operating in the world, which undermines a lot, not all, but a lot of modern science and a lot of modern society. And of course, as landscape archaeologists, we are deeply implicit in precisely that domination of nature paradigm, that narrative. Particularly when we think about the wider context, the context in which we work, which is, of course, the climate emergency, the Anthropocene, as Katie suggested, industrial agriculture and the monocultures that are a result of that, and the damage to global health and, of course, human health as well, mass species extinction, where we are now in the middle of the 6th extinction, And you can see some rather scary figures here, like the top one is the decline in global biomass of wild mammals, 82% since prehistory. And this leads me to my unwelcome conclusion. There can be no theory of survey, because survey is, at best, a methodology that is developed to cope with the practicalities of working in the Mediterranean in our current political context. And it's what we do. It's become an accepted academic practice, and we now do it out of habit. As a means of interpreting the intertwined world, this complex interdependent relationship between soils and plants and animals, including humans, and weather systems and gradients and all of these things, it is intellectually inadequate and ethically unacceptable. So, I'm sorry, Bernhard. Survey, as we know it, is dead. I'm tempted just to go and sit down. Your year has mentioned After the Map. Noel Castry's very helpful little geography textbook on nature has a final chapter called Beyond Nature. So what about beyond survey? This is where I subvert my own narrative. Perhaps it's some residual post-processualism still in me from that time in Cambridge, or Sturtgone, which perhaps had a more lasting impact on me than you, I don't know. Because, of course, where we're going now has its seeds in the past of survey and in the present, as I think we are seeing yesterday and especially so far today. Here is part of the Asino Valley, which in 2001 was part of a project you might not be quite familiar with, called the Troodos Archaeological Survey Project. At the end of the season, the three co-directors, Bernhard, Lena and me, and I don't know if you're going to remember this, if you have different memories from me, I'd be interested. We got together and we said, this just isn't working. Partly the size of our survey area, but that's a different issue. We made it larger. But also because we had to incorporate more than just the human aspects of that landscape. And it wasn't just archaeology, it was some other bits and pieces. And in particular, geomorphology was essential. And no one's mentioned this yet. This is one of Bernhard's huge contributions to survey and landscape studies in the Mediterranean. From getting Lisa Wells to SCISP in 1996, was it? And since then, of course, this is now standard and widespread. But a lot of that comes from Bernhard's determination. And so what the three co-directors did is we offered to promote Jay Noller, who Lena mentioned yesterday, from being project geomorphologist to being co-director. However, he came with a condition that we change the name. So we had a discussion of that, and someone, I'm pretty sure I'm guilty of this, suggested we could be the Troodos Archaeological and Ecological Survey Project. It didn't fly, quite rightly, in the context. Ecology was still seen as being very mechanistic, still very environmentally determinist. It was a bad word, like adaptation was a bad word back then, before its recent rehabilitation in the climate emergency context. And so that was rejected in favour of the Troodos Archaeological and Environmental Survey Project, still, however, pronounced TASP. And under that basis, we integrated the geomorphology and other environmental approaches, for example, botany. And it was great. It was fantastic, and Jay's work is absolutely phenomenal, and this is one of his rather unsung achievements here. It's in the monograph, but not much has been made out of it apart from that. You see all these green fields here and here. This is massive land levelling in the late Roman period. for large-scale industrial agriculture to support the large-scale industrial copper mining of Skuriotisa that we saw from Lena yesterday. Jay reckoned that they moved about the same volume of soil as the volume of stone in Khufu's pyramid in Giza. So it's absolutely massive. So that was great, and there were other insights like that. Looking back on it, though, I can't help wondering if even so the geology is here, the geology, even the bits and pieces of botany that Neil Irwin did, which were great in themselves, but they were still rather backdrops to the archaeological survey, particularly as demonstrated here. What is interesting here, nearly 20 years later, is, as Michael Barton says, in the last decade, ecology has discovered a past. So it's not just this static framework. It is, it's dynamic, it changes. There are these complex changes through time in the interactions between all the different players in the landscapes, including humans. And there's been something of a ecological turn in some Mediterranean survey. So we're getting a virus of multi-proxy graphs like this one. This is from that fantastic team from Uppsala, Erika Weiberg, Anton Bonnier, and Martin Finet. I'm not going to go into the details beyond to say that, as always, there are gaps when things really get interesting, by the time you get late Roman and Byzantine, but no, never mind. One thing that appears from this one is that the environmental data is really pretty impressive and varied and high resolution. The archaeological data is sites from intensive survey projects and is a bit clunky, but they've done other work which fills that in a little bit better than that. So on top of ecology, there's another strand, I think, just beginning within landscape archaeology, which is systems theory. And this is an attempt for me, I suppose, to update that settlement hierarchy diagram from the Skizit volume. So at the center of it is the self-organizing socio-ecological system, okay? So this is society ecology as, a single, integrated, interdependent entity. It's not static because it gets hit by droughts or floods, poverty, changing ideologies or whatever, gets knocked out of kilter a little bit, but then it can adapt or change or absorb, and it comes back again. So you get this sort of process like this. So this is the dynamic system. Okay? It's never static, it never stays quite the same, but it retains its basic sort of character. It's ultimately the same entity. This is resilience theory specifically. I would add to that as well as this being a resilient state, I would call it a convivial state. This is a demonstration of conviviality, which is that socio-ecological resilience that I've just talked about. But in addition, this is going back to the discussion of narratives that we've just been having in the last two papers. There is a powerful set of human narratives about the interdependence of all of these different players that recognizes that interdependence and fosters it and maintains it. So this is a convivial system. But even so, it can be hit by the really big drivers like severe climate change, and it gets knocked over a tipping point into catastrophic change. And of course, our society is sort of in this area, just before the tipping point in some respects, just after the tipping point. And as I said before, as landscape archaeologists, we are deeply implicated in this, and particularly in the paradigm that supports extractivism, for example. The notion that nature, the environment, what's around us, is just out there for us to exploit as much as we want, without any care about our future, our children's future, our students' future, our world's future. Here's a lovely book that takes on board exactly this systems theory. Prehistorians in the room might not know it that well because most of it is just the last 500 years or so. What's really great about this project is, of course, the haystacks. I love the haystacks. But look at the title of the book. The S word isn't there. Okay? Survey. Also, the name of the project is the Shala Valley Project. They don't say it's a survey project. They're being much more interdisciplinary as its core. And as a demonstration of, that, they have this lovely schematic multiproxy diagram here, where you can see down the side there's some environmental variables like temperature, precipitation, but there's landscape investment, seasonality, marrying outside the village, trade and exchange, and so on. And there's some very nice patterns there, which I can't go into now. Not every project can do everything, so their ecological data is a little bit thin up on top here, and actually comes from comparative projects just beyond the boundaries of the survey area. But it's a fantastic read for making you think about these changing dynamics of interactions between all of these different players. And this, for me, is beyond survey. This is the future of survey. Now, all of that you could see as an example of entangled communities, okay, which I realise slightly belatedly is actually in my title, even if I've moved on considerably from my title in the last few months. So, entangled communities meaning entangled ecological communities just as much as human communities. That's what we're looking for in the past, and that's what those last few projects are doing. That's what we've just been hearing as well. But there's another really important aspect to this, because we are not just studying convivial communities in the past or assessing their levels of conviviality. We are thinking about convivial communities in the present, including those that are our own or with which we are participating with, we are dealing with, for example, in the areas where we work. And here I really want to point out one totally groundbreaking project, which is out of Erin Gibson, who's sitting back there. She can wave. Very small wave from Erin there. Who went back to one of the villages that we worked in and around mostly, in Taspnikitari in the North Troodos. And instead of coming in saying, this is what we found, and having giving the lecture, the monologue, dictating, she went and listened and facilitated, particularly through women's groups, through schools. And if I'm misrepresenting to you, Erin, please do say. And this has resulted in a fantastic sense of community initiative and ambition. And Erin's there in the background trying to help a little bit and facilitating. So you get wonderful cross-generational sharing like this, where Mr. Panayotis takes the school children up to the ruined village in the Isinu Valley, where he himself grew up. So you do get this, you really get the sense of the conviviality, the recognized interdependence of generations, different types of human communities coming together, but also the pines and the goats and all the rest of it that I don't have time to talk about here. So this, I think, is the way forward, where the research that we do isn't just about the landscape, it is resolutely in the landscape. As Yoria was talking about, we are totally embedded in the landscape. So that is what I'm calling convivial research. Here is the research, and it spins out into all of these different aspects, all of these different players in the landscape. Because there is no space for science outside of the world it engages with. So, to sum up, survey is dead. Long live ecology, long live conviviality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. As always, challenging. We have about 3 minutes of quick questions. Anyone like to ask something?
Need some coffee.
Well,
go ahead.
Let's have one leading go to ask you. So how would you, if you were asked now, how would you reconstruct a project team or group to be convivial successfully?
Okay. Reconstruct a project team to be convivial, yes. That is a hard one. The first thing in terms of the methodology, I suppose, is a total integration of the archaeology, all the different ecological studies, and the history and the oral interviews of the local history. That's one aspect of it. The other would be some form of co-research, co-leadership between a range of involved communities, which would involve local communities, others on the island, as well as a sort of different academic communities. That's a starting point.
Okay. Oh, Tom Davis.
I have to kick it back a little bit. I work, besides Cyprus, in a place that is going through a very difficult post-colonial transition in Kazakhstan. And oftentimes, the advantages or the values we see as scholars, as a convivialist, which I love this idea, is completely rejected by both local community and authorities in the setting. So it becomes a challenging educational process which has its own colonialist elements to it. So it is not easy.
Absolutely. It's a real paradox, that, isn't it? Yes, it's challenging. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment for all concerned. And deep, as you say, deep reflection about our role at the same time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now it is coffee break now, and they'll be hanging out there. We have 30 minutes starting now for coffee break. Please then come back. We'll shout at you, but please come back in 25 minutes.